let me begin by thanking you all for coming, of course. I'd like to thank Advocata and Fernando in particular for the invitation, and also thank Echelon magazine for co-sponsoring this event and a series of lectures to follow, I gather. I just want to make 3 points by way of introduction before I launch into the hard content of my talk. The first is to reinforce the points that Dhananath made about Advocata. I think the time is definitely right for a think tank, a forum, to promote limited government, free markets in a genuinely open society here in Sri Lanka. This combination has always been very weakly represented here. It's a set of beliefs that scattered individuals hold, but it's time that they were represented collectively. And also to appeal to the young, the dynamic, the aspirational, not just here in Colombo, but beyond, in the second-tier cities, in the small towns, and of course, in particular, among those whose mother tongues are Sinhala and Tamil. And I would hope, as Advocata grows, that it does things genuinely differently. There are far too many organizations, including think tanks, here in Sri Lanka, that are very hierarchical, very stuffy, very bureaucratic, very cautious, and which seem to be unwilling and unable to communicate with the public out there in straight, plain-talking language. So I'm counting on Advocata people to do things differently, to be unstuffy, to be unhierarchical, to be unbureaucratic, to speak plainly, and to show that collectively things can be done differently in Sri Lanka, to appeal to the kind of audience that I mentioned, the young, the dynamic, the aspirational. And the ideas that people have been faced with in the past have clearly not worked. It begins with a romantic socialism, which still attracts some thinking people, or allegedly thinking people. Sri Lanka has had its fair shares of revolutionary utopias. They've been refuted by history. We know now the reality of how China and Russia really worked, rather than the romantic visions of them going back a generation or two. There are still people around in Sri Lanka, I won't mention any names here, but you know who they are, who, for example, eulogized Fidel Castro when he died just a couple of weeks ago. Well, we know, it is documented, that Fidel Castro was a crook, a thug, and a murderer on a not insignificant scale. But he was a saint, of course, compared with Stalin and Mao and Trotsky, who between them, among them, killed scores more millions than even Hitler. So we should say goodbye to those revolutionary utopias. I have a quote here from the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, who said, "What has always made the state a hell on earth has been precisely that many have tried to make it a heaven. We should not try to create heaven on earth, because we end up making a living hell out of it." Sri Lanka has also been seduced by communal socialisms of the Tamil variety and of the Sinhala variety, and they have torn this country apart, of course. It has been seduced by the crony socialism of the SLFP. Who has that benefited? The Bandaranayakas, then the Rajapaksas, and their bootlickers, of course. And finally, not least, Sri Lanka has been seduced by the crony capitalism of the UNP. And who has that benefited? A Colombo oligarchy, of course, but not nearly enough Sri Lankans outside that charmed circle. So there is an alternative of a a smaller but more effective government, of free individuals in what Sir Karl Popper called an open society, and that's what Advocata is there for. A second note, just to express my own limits here, and I hope this is a note of humility. Some people in Sri Lanka dismiss me as this Suddha who swans in from time to time and pontificates on what is good and what is bad in Sri Lanka. It is true, my Sinhala is very basic. I don't speak Tamil. I don't live here. I haven't lived here since the age of 12 or 13. And I clearly don't know the detail and the nuance that all of you, or nearly all of you in this room, and others have. And there are others who could give this talk much better than I. So all I can do is really try and say it as I see it, plainly, and without holding back too many punches. One of my great heroes is George Orwell. Orwell, by the way, was a convinced democratic socialist, and he denigrated capitalism. But he was an incredibly clear writer and speaker. He spoke honestly. He wrote a very clear language. It was not a political language. There was nothing fake or stuffy about it. So that's the least I can do in addressing the topic I have today. My third and final point by way of introduction is that when Dhananath asked me to give this lecture, what I did not want to do was to give a small picture talk. Least of all, yet another assessment of the budget. I can't think of anything more boring, frankly. And there are plenty of others who can do that far better than I. So I am not going to give a budget post-mortem, as it were, although I might have a few comments to make about it on the way. Rather, what I'm going to do is to give a very big picture lecture. And it's a pre-1990s presentation, my favorite. In other words, no PowerPoint, no slides at all, so that you're not looking over there, you're looking here at me. And it's a talk based on 3 scenarios for Sri Lanka's future. So let me briefly introduce those scenarios. The first one, scenario 1, is of drift, which is a continuation of the present. The second one is what I call takeoff. That's the scenario that all of us, I hope, in this room want to see, and what, of course, our politicians have promised us. The third scenario is relapse, sliding back to where we were before January 8th, 2015. So I would like to walk through all 3 scenarios and then come up with my conclusion, but let me give you my conclusion straight away. Another of my favorite writers, the French philosopher Montaigne, once said that he likes a man to start with his conclusion. So let me start with my conclusion. My conclusion is that we are in scenario 1. We are very, very far away from scenario 2 takeoff. But we are closer, dangerously closer to scenario 3, in other words, relapse. And scenario 1, drift, is an inherently unstable situation. So relapse is lurking around the corner, and we really have to advance to scenario 2, takeoff, because the alternative is relapse. In other words, the stakes are very high. But I will elaborate on that in due course. So let me move to that first scenario of drift. It's the obvious place to start, to extrapolate from the present. So where are we now? Let me give you my assessment of that for what it's worth. Better than where we were almost 2 years ago, but not by much. And it should be much, much better than it is by now, by a long shot. What are the credits? Well, the good news is that we have a little bit more liberalism and democracy in Sri Lanka than we had under the Rajapaksas. People seem to have lost their fear for the moment. The media is certainly freer and criticizes liberally. There is a 19th Amendment to the Constitution. There are restored independent commissions for public service appointments. And there's a new constitution in the works. The ethnic temperature is lower than it was a couple of years ago. And yes, the right symbolic overtures have been made to the minorities. And the third good news is that foreign relations have been rebalanced. So what was a very China-weighted foreign policy now has good relations to China. I'll come back to that. But restored relations with India and the West. So all of that is good news. What's the bad news? The bad news to begin with is, of course, that there is no Yahal Palanaya. Good governance is back to where it was before the Rajapaksas. In other words, back to mediocre governance and rife corruption and nepotism, and that is, I suppose, what disappoints people most of all. On the ethnic relations front, I'm no expert here, but my broad take is that the fundamental issues have still not been dealt with. Land restitution, redress for human rights abuses, demilitarization, and not least, of course, genuine devolution of power. But the politics of all that are clearly daunting for any government which has to look behind its shoulder to the Sinhala Buddhist heartland. That's understandable. What I think has really gone wrong is the economy. And that's crucial, because without getting that right or better, everything else really does fall apart. So let me concentrate on the economic situation and then extrapolate a little into the future. It begins with really very bad macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy and monetary policy in the first instance. Now this is of course not new. It has been the case almost since independence, with governments spending far too much and with creating far too much money. So there's been too much public debt created, inflation, current account deficits, and a weaker currency. This government, until recently at least, made it worse, starting with fiscal policy. So we had two very bad budgets last year. Price controls, exchange controls, chopping and changing with all sorts of ad hoc taxes. In other words, a continuation of what was happening before. And all of that led to the government going with a begging bowl yet again to the International Monetary Fund. And a new agreement with the fund, a new facility was negotiated. Now in the short term that seems to have delivered somewhat better news. The situation has stabilized a little. The last budget, at least to date, was not as disastrous as the previous two budgets. If things go according to plan, and that of course is a big if with implementation in Sri Lanka, then Sri Lanka might get closer to having revenue closer to 15% of GDP as opposed to 10-11% of GDP. It's good news, but it's limited because the budget is still not about serious tax reform. It's about doing the minimum to satisfy IMF requirements and preventing a full-blown crisis. But it's not about serious tax or wider fiscal reform, which I'll come to later. Monetary policy was also very bad until a few months ago. The central bank became far too politicized over a 10-year period. Interest rates were kept artificially low, and there was too much money printing, basically to support an unviable fiscal policy. And of course, there were scandals with regulation, particularly of the primary bond market, shocking. The one bit of good news, the only good senior appointment this government has made, was the appointment of Indrajit Kumaraswamy as the new governor of the central bank. He is just the right man for the job. He has excellent credentials. He is clean, he is competent. He's also got a very good temperament. And I think in the last few months he has done his level best to restore integrity and credibility to the central bank, to focus monetary policy on some key objectives, starting with price stability, and to clean up its regulatory act, not least regulation of the primary bond market. And I think all of those here and those outside this room who want to see Sri Lanka have genuinely good, independent, competent public institutions should support the central bank governor to the hilt. All the more important because, of course, there are governing politicians out there who seek to undermine him and to eat away at the central bank's authority and to repoliticize the central bank, and they should be resisted with full force. What about other areas of public policy? Well, I think the good news is that starting with the Prime Minister, the diagnosis is much better than it was under the previous government. The Sri Lankan economy has a competitiveness problem. It has a productivity problem. The way to raise productivity and to raise competitiveness is to have a stronger private sector and also to have much more globalization for Sri Lanka. More trade, more exports, more imports, as well as more foreign investment. But to do that, policies need to change. And the first set of policies that need to change are what one could call doing business policies. As the business people in the room know, there is a serious problem here with approvals for various projects. Going through multiple agencies, taking too long, corruption, the lack of technology, the lack of things that are online. And these are simple reforms that have been done successfully abroad. The government has promised them here. It's been promised in 2 prime ministerial economic policy statements. But so far, after almost 2 years, we have seen nothing. So there begins the disappointment. Trade. Sri Lanka has a much weaker game on trade and foreign investment. A country like this has a shockingly low trade to GDP ratio, exports plus imports to GDP. It's 50% or less. Exports, if you include services, are about 20%. These numbers should be at least double. It's got worse over the last 15 years. The country receives a trickle of foreign investment, less than $1 billion this year, and hardly any of it is for export. It's for local projects. The export basket remains static. Tea, other plantation crops, and garments. But it hasn't diversified into all the sorts of exports that East Asian countries have diversified into. Sri Lanka is not in global value chains with the exception of garments, not in ICT, not in all sorts of services. To rectify that, we need significant trade and investment liberalization, bearing in mind that the last government increased levels of protection significantly. Again, the government in very vague terms has promised some of this, but we have seen nothing so far after almost 2 years. And then there are the more difficult reforms, certainly more difficult politically, like reforming state-owned enterprises, land reform, reforming labor markets, education and skills, where again, nothing has been done. That's perhaps more understandable because these are genuinely more tricky politically and might have to wait until after the next elections for the most part. But very little to nothing has been done, even on the areas which are perhaps politically less difficult. Now, one key reason why these reforms are necessary is, let me put it in very simple terms, Sri Lanka needs much more competition, whether that competition comes from new players who are Sri Lankan or foreign players. But it is really striking what little competition there is in the Sri Lankan economy wherever one looks. Most markets are tied up by little monopolies or oligopolies, and the commanding heights are occupied by the Dhammika Pereiras and the Hari Jayawardhanas of this world with their political connections, who are sitting on very comfortable rents. And of course, the last thing they want is competition. And there is collusion between these commanding heights and the political class. That is bad in all sorts of ways. Sri Lanka needs creative destruction, as the economist Joseph Schumpeter put it, whether it comes from foreigners or whether it comes from locals. But they are, of course, blocked at every turn. It's bad for efficiency in production, and of course, if you will excuse my French, it screws consumers. All of this, I think, boils down to one fact. There is still no economic plan for reforming the economy. It is good that Sri Lanka is getting advice from Professor Ricardo Hausman and his colleagues at Harvard. It is good, perhaps, that McKinsey has been hired to set up a delivery unit for reforms. But none of these are substitutes for homegrown basic plan of action with some basic priorities. One doesn't need the white man coming in from abroad for that. It's not rocket science. Some of it I've outlined, and these are not original ideas of mine either. They just need to be on the table, and they need some kind of basic implementation mechanism, but that's not been forthcoming in the last couple of years. I have one final worry, and that's about foreign relations. As I said, the good news is that foreign relations have been rebalanced, and we have much better relations with India and the West. It is also good that relations have been restored with China after that initial hostility of the first few months after the presidential election. The Port City project makes sense. No one else is interested in Hambantota, so why not have a Chinese, even an exclusively Chinese industrial zone that covers all those Rajapaksa vanity projects, including that port in Hambantota, and relieve the government's debt burden in the process through this debt-to-equity swap. But this is what worries me. Sri Lanka is now drifting back to influence, to Chinese influence, but without the appropriate countervailing balance of productive private sector investment coming from the West and India. And that investment, by the way, would be far more productive than what we would get from Chinese state-owned companies. The imbalance which we have been drifting back towards over the past year, of relying again almost exclusively on China for large-scale foreign investment, is both a worry on the economic front and the security front. It's a worry on the economic front because, and again, let me speak plainly, the Chinese practice a different kind of capitalism, at least Chinese state capitalism. Chinese private sector capitalism is incredibly entrepreneurial. But the kind of Chinese capitalism that we have in Sri Lanka is the capitalism of the Chinese Communist Party state and its proxies. I'm not against that in principle, as long as it's balanced by healthier investment from the West and India. But we should know what kind of rules this kind of capitalism plays by, and there's evidence of how it's been played out in East Asia. It is about buying up political and business elites. Do we really want to see that happen in Sri Lanka? It's already happening. It happened under the last government. And I would certainly urge the media and independent observers to scrutinize these projects very carefully, including the Hambantota project. It's a security concern as well, because we need to have good friendships all around, including good friendships with the Americans, the Europeans, and the Indians. The last thing we need is another PLA submarine slipping into a Sri Lankan port. And let's not forget, the Chinese are playing the long game here, not just for commercial advantage, but for other reasons as well. And we should have no illusions about that. So let me ask the question, why has little changed in an underlying sense, in economics, in politics? Let me just point out two or three factors that occurred to me. The first one is complacency. This is something really accursed in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is blessed with a natural bounty in the wet zone, and with a Sinhala Buddhist culture that dovetails with that natural bounty. It's all in Robert Knox, who wrote the best book written by any Sudha about Sri Lanka 4 centuries ago. There is definitely lacking here a culture of work, of striving, of self-improvement, of responsibility. There's too much of a culture of expecting coconuts to keep falling into one's lap, and the feeling perhaps that the rest of the world owes Sri Lanka a living. And what that breeds, particularly among Sri Lanka's elite, is an introversion and parochialism. There's a saying about Argentines, that Argentinians love to compare themselves with themselves. And to be frank, that reminds me of a lot of Sri Lankans, who love to compare themselves with themselves, but not with better practice outside and how it can be adapted here for the benefit of all Sri Lankans. My second observation about a root cause is really about the nature of the political class. Again, what is striking is that even though the government has changed, the political class hasn't. Musical chairs have been played within the political class. And it's not just a case of the wrong thinking and wrong words coming out and wrong actions, but the serious vested interests of incumbents, who, of course, don't want a younger and better generation to break through and do things differently, because that threatens their interests, and it threatens the interests of their business cronies. So it's a problem not just with the political class, but with the commanding heights of business as well. And I've come around to the conclusion that nothing fundamental is going to change in Sri Lanka unless we see a breakthrough of a younger and better generation, both in politics and business. And that I'll come to later. But let me just single out a quote for you. It's from a British journalist from about 50 years ago. He visited Ceylon in the early 50s. His name is Harry Hopkins. He said this about the Burmese political class, but it doesn't require much imagination to apply it here. I quote, "A taste for melodramatics, the juvenile striking of poses, the individualism that turns to dacoity or political privateering, the oversensitive national pride that becomes first a morbid resentment of all criticism, then xenophobia. It all added up rather disastrously to a tendency to anarchism, to a preference of the florid gesture, to the dreary but effective business of getting down to the job." That reminds you of some people, no doubt. So, let me project all of this a little bit into the future, this scenario of drift. What does it look like? Well, it looks like what is said of Brazil. You know what is said of Brazil? Brazil is the country of the future, always was and always will be. So there's that golden potential out there, but it's never achieved because Sri Lanka keeps, as my friend Vissa Jayatilak puts it, missing buses. Or Sri Lanka never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I hope that opportunity has not been squandered. It's late in the day, but that window is still there. I hope it's grasped. If it isn't, then we will see this continued drift. In other words, an ossified political and business elite, mal-governance, bad to mediocre governance, ethnic tensions perhaps on the boil without quite boiling over, a creeping drift towards overweening Chinese influence, and economic stagnation. But let me try and make that less abstract. What economic drift, not achieving that potential, means is that outside a narrow elite, ordinary Sri Lankans will be deprived of opportunity, of livelihoods and of life chances that they deserve. What that means is a continued underclass that Elmo Jayawardena and his wife and happy band of brothers and sisters cater to, people who do live hand to mouth across the country. And a much bigger class of Sri Lankans who are not perhaps in dire straits, but who are underdeveloped in every sense. Undereducated, underskilled, underpaid, underproductive, underworked, all of which translates into the driver of a three-wheeler looking for scraps of work, whose son becomes the driver of a three-wheeler, or a maid who goes to the Gulf, sometimes gets treated barbarically, sends money back to a good-for-nothing husband usually, whose daughter becomes a maid doing the same thing. And there are so many stories like that. Is that going to continue into the indefinite future? That's my scenario 1. Scenario 2, to be optimistic, is the takeoff scenario. So let me run you through that without taking too long about it. What are its general features? Well, of course, it's about Sri Lanka finally taking advantage of external opportunities to achieve its long-promised potential. What would that look like? Well, it would look like a growth rate of closer to 6 to 8%, as opposed to 4 to 5%. A growth rate enough to increase real incomes, per capita incomes, that would translate into tangible benefits, not just for a narrow elite, but for a broad majority, and not just in Colombo and Western Province, but way outside across the island, and across the ethnicities as well. It would need to be driven by a private sector engine and a foreign engine as well. In other words, a combination of domestic private sector investment and globalization. On the globalization front, what it would look like in numbers terms is, over however many years, trade rising to above 100% of GDP, which is what East Asian countries with a similar population have. In fact, well above. In Malaysia and Taiwan, it's 150 to 200%. They have populations that are roughly similar to Sri Lanka's. Vietnam, with a population of almost 100 million, has trade to GDP of about 150%. It would look like an export basket that diversifies way beyond garments and plantation crops, which are going to be under more pressure from low-cost countries, into some manufacturing niches, but above all into services sectors, perhaps starting with shipping and logistics. It would look like much more foreign investment, $3 to $5 billion a year, not less than $1 billion. And some foreign investment that is intended for production for export, not just to build condos and other little local things which are generally less productive. But all of that is not going to happen without a series of reforms, which I intimated when I talked about scenario 1. Let me elaborate here with scenario 2. What are those policy reforms? It begins with the maxim, first do no harm. In other words, simpler, more predictable policy, no more chopping and changing of taxes, no more price controls, no more announcement of exchange controls, and so on. Secondly, it needs a stable macroeconomic policy and long last that goes beyond the IMF program. In other words, serious tax reform, where Sri Lanka moves towards taxes that are genuinely simpler, relatively low on both corporate and personal income tax, with few exemptions. And if the yardstick is simplicity, then the revenue will come in, as it has in many other countries. This is not mere speculation. The best examples, of course, are places like Singapore, Dubai, Georgia, and Estonia. On the monetary policy side, it needs price stability and a genuinely independent central bank. It needs a market-led exchange rate, which will probably depreciate further given external conditions, increasingly so with the probable further rise of US interest rates and the appreciation of the dollar. Thirdly, it needs those doing business reforms that have been promised for the last 2 years. Much more stuff online, much less discretion for the bureaucrat, fewer agencies involved, shorter deadlines, and automatic procedures. Mr. Modi has done this in India, not comprehensively, but quite a lot actually, in such a huge, complicated state. And this is really a matter of political will and leadership, because with the right will and with a few competent people in charge, this is the sort of thing that can be done, and especially in a small country. It's less complicated, or should be, than it is in a large, diverse country like India. There's a lot of legislation from the early independence years that needs to be got rid of, not least for small-scale entrepreneurs. Trade reforms need to happen. We need the removal of a lot of additional tariffs on imports. We need a big simplification and reduction of the nominal tariffs on imports to get rid of export controls. We need a genuine one-stop shop for foreign investment. We need much better trade facilitation so that customs actually does work, like it does in some East Asian countries. And technology here is very much part of the answer. Again, none of these things have really been forthcoming so far. They need to happen. And then beyond that, there are the structural reforms that I talked about earlier, like reforming the public sector, labour markets and so on, that are politically more difficult to tackle, but there should be at least a medium-term agenda to do something about that. Now, it's not just a matter of reforming policies, I think it's also a matter of reforming institutions. It's difficult to see these policies changing with certain people in charge of these policies. In other words, we need better personnel at cabinet level and below. We need fewer ministries, a smaller cabinet, that's obvious. We need civil service reform down the line as well. Ideally a smaller, better paid, better targeted, better trained civil service. These are of course all medium to long-term fixes, not short-term fixes. And Sri Lanka, I think, needs more institutional checks on the discretion of politicians and bureaucrats. Other countries have it. There are sunset clauses on legislation, on regulation. There's less discretion in some countries for the head of government or for the cabinet to simply issue decrees or ordinances without going through parliament. Other countries have much stricter judicial review of such discretionary legislation or delegated legislation. There need to be more genuinely independent cost-benefit analyses of this or that regulation. All of the things that Sri Lanka doesn't have. There's one aspect of policy reform that I want to talk about just a little bit before I move on to my third scenario, and that's decentralization. This is a very centralized polity. Everything, of course, emanates from and leads back to the Colombo political elite, and of course its allied business elite, whichever party happens to be in power. Now, one thing that I've learned from doing some work on cities for the World Economic Forum is that the most successful reforms around the world are not actually done by international organizations, far from it. Not in Brussels by the European institutions at supranational level. Not even in national capitals. But the most successful reforms are done in small regions and cities, above all in cities. which are closer to the citizen, where you can experiment more, where you can be pragmatic, where you can learn better from, from better practice in other cities and other regions, and where you often can have a mayor who fancies himself or herself as a CEO, someone who really is can-do. And I can give you plenty of examples of successful cities around the world. And these reforms percolate and spread, bottom up, as it were. The best example is from China. The success of China is first and foremost not down to the omniscience and competence of the Chinese Communist Party. That's, of course, the narrative that they would like you to believe. It's about Deng Xiaoping choosing a little fishing village called Shenzhen in the south of China, far away from Beijing politics, and allowing a reform experiment to happen there, which was successful, the first special economic zone, and which was copied all over China because of its success. And some of those reforms were then rolled out nationwide. Shenzhen is now a city of 11 million people, 4 million people more than Hong Kong. It is one of China's dynamos. So what's the lesson there for Sri Lanka? It's that we need more decentralized politics, and with it more decentralized business. And I'm not talking in the first instance of dysfunctional provincial councils. I'm talking about devolving power, real power over taxation and expenditure to municipal authorities and mayors, and new rules of governance for these decentralized units to allow these experiments to happen, because there's a better chance that they will happen there than they will in Colombo at the national level. This is an issue for the megapolis. All the talk about the megapolis has been about engineering fixes. Naya Vijay Surya will understand this because he's an engineer by background. So it's about urban development in a narrow sense. But no one talks about the governance of the megapolis. What are going to be the rules for the megapolis? Because if the rules are not going to change, you can probably bet your bottom dollar or rupee that the megapolis will fail for all the usual political reasons. It needs a different kind of executive authority with devolved powers, which would also allow a new elite to emerge. A different channel from Colombo, as it were, in the cities. And of course, it's not just Colombo, it's the second-tier cities and some of the other towns as well. A new political elite and a new business elite. So I think policy decentralization is vital. So much for the economic contours of this second scenario. What does it mean for things that are beyond economics? Well, ethnic relations, to begin with. A very basic point here. If the economic pie is static or shrinking, it means more political conflict, more distributional conflict. That's the lesson of history. If a country is not growing economically to satisfy the aspirations of people, people will fight more over slices of the pie or the cake. And in Sri Lanka, of course, that translates into racial, ethnic, and religious fights. If the pie is growing 6 to 8% rather than 4 to 5%, it means more to share around. And of course, ethnic relations are much more complicated than this, and that's a whole different lecture or series of lectures. But the precondition arguably is to have a sustainably growing economy, to ease the passage for genuine ethnic reconciliation. That's the basic point I want to make there. And similarly for foreign relations, a country that's growing at 6 to 8% means a country that has investment coming in from the pucker business houses in India, not the third or fourth division dodgy companies who do special deals with the BOI. It means decent big-ticket investment from Europe and the United States and Japan and elsewhere. And that means genuinely balanced foreign relations rather than falling into the kind of China trap that I outlined a moment ago. So, the summary features of This scenario too is of a prosperous and cosmopolitan society. That means a Sri Lanka, not just a Sinhala Buddhist Sri Lanka, and open to the world east and west, as well as up to our big neighbor up north. The bad news is that this is still very far away. So for all the talk, it is not around the corner. It is not going to take off imminently because the hard work has not been done. And without that happening, it is not going to be like the proverbial coconut falling into a Sri Lankan lap. That's the bad news. But the prize, I think, is still very much there to be had. The window is still open. But narrower, because 2 years have lapsed in the process. Let me move on now to my third and most worrying and alarming scenario, which I call relapse. So this is a Rajapaksa-like scenario, with echoes of Mr. Premadasa and J.R. Jayawardena and Mr. and Mrs. Bandaranaike. What is it? Let's start with politics. It is about a relapse into big man authoritarian politics, rather like Vladimir Putin's Russia. So a charismatic big man comes along, taking advantage of social discontent, wins a presidential election, and comes in to clean house, which means neutering opponents, individuals as well as institutions. It means someone who rides at the head of a movement rather than a political party, and a movement that co-opts those opposed into the tent through a combination of carrots and sticks, as my friend Chandra Jayaratna puts it. So a return to illiberal democracy, to use the political science jargon. It means, secondly, back to a statist economy, where the state has a much bigger direct role through the public sector, as well as a much bigger indirect role by shaping the private sector, as well as, of course, the military in the economy. It means allowing foreigners in much more selectively through very specific channels, providing they cut the right deals with the right people, the right family, the right clan. And that is a recipe for stagnation. It will be dressed up in the revolutionary socialist language of the past, of course. And there will be plenty of useful idiots and fellow travelers to justify it in the opinion pages of newspapers and online. Again, we know who these people are. Ethnic relations. This is perhaps the most worrying feature of the scenario. This big man is invariably going to be a Sinhala Buddhist chauvinist, riding at the head of a resurgent Sinhala Buddhist movement. Now, this is, of course, a long strand in Sri Lankan history. I hope I don't get firebombed for saying that it began with Advocata-Echelon. It's reared its ugly head since independence. It reared a particularly ugly head under the Rajapaksas. It strikes a chord with some in the Sinhala Buddhist heartland and among the Sangha. And the scenario is of this constituency resurgent, allied with the kind of politicians that I mentioned. And of course, the narrative here would be that Sri Lanka has been sold to the minorities and that Sinhala Buddhism has been sold down the Mave, as it were. Now, what I've noticed on my travels around Sri Lanka is that the reaction of the minorities to this is rather like the hedgehog. You put up your own defensive mechanisms and you retreat into your own shell. True particularly about Jaffna Tamils. There is something, there's a phrase about the Jaffna Peninsula. It has a peninsularity of mind. Boy, does it have a peninsularity of mind, which one sees in elements of the TNA and with Chief Justice Vigneswaran. That would be reinforced. I see it with the community I come from, the Muslim community here, which has a worrying strain of Islamic fundamentalism, which wasn't there when I grew up here, but it's definitely there now. It's a kind of mimicking of what they see happening within Sinhala Buddhism. So that's a recipe for a Sri Lanka of multiple solitudes, to borrow a Canadian term. As well as, of course, a recipe not just for more ethnic tension, but ethnic violence. The final feature of this relapse scenario is of an acceleration to preponderant Chinese influence. In other words, that Chinese state capitalism buying up in a much more comprehensive way the political and business elites of Sri Lanka, with security, geopolitical implications as well. Now, there are those in the Colombo elite who might dismiss what I say as fanciful, who would say, we've made a fundamental change since January the 8th, 2015. We are not going back to all of that. That's behind us. We may get all sorts of things wrong now, but we put all of that behind us. Really. I would consider myself either naive or stupid or both if I were to dismiss this scenario. I'm not saying it's going to happen, it's not pre-programmed, but it is a plausible scenario. And with rising social discontent, particularly outside Colombo, I think this scenario becomes more plausible by the day or by the month in the run-up to the next presidential election. So I would take it very seriously. And we have to, I think, ask ourselves some very hard, direct questions. One is this. Sinhala society is very hierarchical and very deferential. There has historically been a yearning for the big man in Sinhala Buddhist society. Dutugevunu character, Parakababahu character. And political conditions might be right for the return of that kind of man, or someone who pretends to be that kind of man. Sinhala habits of the heart, as it were, to borrow a phrase from a great French political thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville. And we have to ask ourselves another question. It is not so long ago that feral Sinhala mobs not only burned Tamil shops, but Tamil people, and raped women in public, and disgustingly mutilated other Sinhalese on coastal roadsides and on hill country roadsides. It is not that long ago that atrocities equally bad, if not worse, were committed by the LTTE and other Tamil terrorist organizations. Is that really behind us? Again, I'm not persuaded. I would like to say it is, but I think Sri Lanka's foundations are still too brittle to say that it is definitively. So let me now come to my conclusion. To summarize, a scenario extrapolating from the present of drift, not a very good news scenario at all. A second scenario of takeoff, a third scenario of relapse. But my punchline, as it were, is this. I don't think this present scenario, extrapolating from the present, is a stable one. I don't think we can be assured that we can continue to drift, therefore we need not be too worried. That, I think, is part of that accursed Sri Lankan elite complacency. Rather, I think the danger is that if we don't make judicious moves towards scenario 2, the takeoff scenario, we are going to go back into a scenario 3 of relapse. So the stakes are very, very high. And to me, moving towards a scenario of genuine renewal, starting with an economic takeoff, is not just about the usual economist talk, because normally economists would talk about doing these policy reforms and doing these institutional or structural reforms. It's about an injection of fresh blood into Sri Lanka's elite, its political elite and its business elite. Because without that, I don't think things are going to change fundamentally. And this is perhaps the most difficult question of all. It's not in the interests of the present incumbents to change things fundamentally. So how does one bring about some kind of breakthrough for the young, the dynamic, the aspirational, who have a vision of a different way to organize things in Sri Lanka? And I think we have to think very hard and very carefully about that, about finding those avenues. And I think that's something that Advocata should also do in terms of putting on its collective thinking cap. Thank you very much.